Thank you, Brotherhood, for hosting this really important conversation. Thank you all for attending. I want to jump right into our content by talking about the fact that the first thing we need to talk about were not anticipated when we set this thing up. This was going to be about campus antisemitism. This was going to be about from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, and what Jewish kids do with that kind of bullying atmosphere. So this was supposed to be about campus anti-Semitism, and then, of course, last night, Iran launched 330 drones and missiles on Israel. So, Jevin, I want to start by just asking you how you processed last night. I know you have family in Israel. I know your machatenista are Israeli. Could you just tell us about how you did last night?
As I'm sure it was for all of you, last night was terrifying. We were reliving October 7th all over again. And in my case, I mean, my daughter married an Israeli she fell in love with on a birthright trip. So we're talking about Hillel. And I have this whole family now in Israel, and we were in constant touch with them. And they're in the shelters, and we're describing how many minutes for which type of missiles. And we were terrified. The other thing going through our mind was we have BU students are about to go to Israel in a few weeks. As soon as the semester's over, we have 2 busloads of people, Jewish students and non-Jewish students. We couldn't go in December because no one would go. I mean, the trips officially were going, but it was too close to October 7th. So no one signed up. Birthright numbers were down by over 90% because people were afraid. We were starting to get higher numbers for this trip. I don't know if we're going to go now. No one knows. And I'm supposed to be going with my whole family for the first time since October 7th because since then we couldn't leave our post. So, you know, the trips that you all went on, we were on campus fighting the battle here. This was going to be our trip. And we don't know. No one knows what's going to happen.
And tell us about what it's like to have Israeli family going through last night, and you care so much, and you can do so little. How do you navigate that? Care so much, can do so little conundrum.
It's not easy, right? I mean, on the one hand, we have to tell people we love that we love them. We have to tell them that we can't wait to be with them. And it feels terrible. It feels broken to not be together. It feels broken to not be standing in the same place. It also, I don't know about the rest of you, I felt some pride that the United States and Great Britain and Jordan joined together in helping defend Israel. I felt pride that the Israel Defense Forces this time was ready. So it's filled with emotion.
Yeah. So Jevin, let me get to this story from the beginning. I mean, now you stand as somebody who, you're thinking about Israel and the Jewish people and the Jewish future. That's who you are, that's what you do, that's how you roll. But I'd love to hear how that story began. Could you tell us about where you grew up and the quality, the timbre of Yiddishkeit that did or did not exist in the home of your youth?
Well, by the way, there are some people who would say I grew up in the Newton of New York, which was Roslyn, Long Island. I don't actually agree with that for one important reason, which is, well, there's a lot of similarities, of course. I grew up with a lot of Jews, but not a lot of Judaism. And that really has shaped my life, that idea that I had no non-Jewish friends until college, and I knew almost nothing about Judaism. Almost nothing. And my family had, our history was coming to America and forgetting everything from behind, including even the names of the places we were from. So we have no idea where we were from. No one has, there's not a book, not a piece of paper. There's no memory that was passed down. And we just show up, and the goal is make money, send our kids to Harvard, and make them doctors. That was the plan. Literally, my grandfather sat me down and said, I need to make you a doctor, so let's discuss what we're going to do. So that was the goal.
So, forgive me for being granular. Did you have a bar mitzvah? Did you go to a religious school, like Temple Emmanuel's religious school? What was your Jewish education like? Did you do Rosh Hashanah? Did you do Yom Kippur? Did you do Pesach?
So back then, and many of you were alive and Jews back then, yes? Okay, so back then, most Jews belonged to synagogues and had bar and bat mitzvahs and attended high holiday services and lit candles and attended seders. More than half did all of that, and we were the more than half that did that. We had no idea why, we never discussed it, but we did, that's what we did. But there was no, that was being Jewish. That wasn't Judaism for us because there was no feeling, there was no understanding. It was, we did what Jews did.
And just one last exploration of your youth, just try to appreciate where you are today. Where was Israel in the Judaism of your youth?
So for my family, Israel was very distant. We had no relatives. By the way, we had no relatives who perished in the Holocaust. We had one relative who was the captain of the football team for Columbia University who signed up for the war and died leading men in Normandy. But Israel was very, very distant from us. I remember my grandfather, the one that I think you might end up asking me about, but I remember him saying, Israel's really like America, everyone speaks English. He said, so you don't need to learn Hebrew because everyone speaks English. There was, my mother and father had a terrible divorce, and a man who had none of the things my family described as success, money and Harvard and doctor, joined the family, and he loved Israel, and he taught me to love Israel. He's the one who handed me Exodus, his worn copy of it, and said, you need to read this. He's the one who taught me about Jerusalem, and we read O Jerusalem together. And he's the one who spent hours with me helping my heart grow with love for Israel.
That's your mother's second husband?
Right, Arnie.
Arnie, okay. So Jevin, you come from Roslyn, which has a lot of Jews but not a lot of Judaism, as you're describing it. And then you go to Dartmouth, and what happens at Dartmouth in terms of your neshama, your soul?
Yeah, so I literally go to a place where people were saying to me, I never met a Jew before. I've never been friends with a Jew before. And I said, that's fine. I've never been friends with a non-Jew before. And I never forget, I had a roommate. He was from Wasilla, Alaska. And I said, you want to get a bagel? He had no idea what a bagel was back then. He literally had no idea. When I said knish, forget it. I mean, that wasn't even close. Incidentally, Pesach is coming. I just want you to know what it was like to be Jewish at Dartmouth back then. I remember going into the dining hall on Passover, and there is a massive sign that says, Happy Passover, and below the sign are mounds and mounds of bagels. So I decided I'm going to take the initiative, and I'm going to schedule a meeting with the head of Dartmouth Dining Services to like give them some feedback. Thank you for thinking of the Jews, but you may want to like learn a little bit first. So when I arrived at Dartmouth, it was just obvious. I didn't know that much about Judaism, but it was so obvious people were different than me. And the bagel thing and the knish thing, the way people looked, the way they talked, and literally my first. Before I even arrived at Dartmouth, I went on a freshman trip, and there was a woman I met who ended up being my girlfriend for 2 years, and she was Jewish, and so she said, you should come to Hillel with me. And I had no idea what Hillel was, but I liked this girl. So I said, I'm going to follow her to Hillel. And a rabbi puts his arm around my shoulder, and he says, I'm glad you're here. And that literally began, that was the moment where I actually learned what is Shabbat, what is Kabbalat Shabbat. I learned that a bench is something that you don't just sit on. It's something that we just do. And it was the first time I ever felt belonging to something that actually felt meaningful.
And who was that rabbi?
It was Rabbi Michael Paley. Do any of you know him? His family's from the Boston area. He's your cousin. Amazing. I would not be here if it were not for Michael Paley, and then Daniel Siegel, who came after him, and Arthur Hertzberg, who was the professor of Jewish studies there, who I became basically family with. But the first thing was Hillel and the rabbi saying, come.
And what did Dartmouth Hillel do for you after that initial welcome? How did your relationship with Dartmouth Hillel evolve and grow during your 4 years there?
Well, this was the moment when I realized I was different. I wasn't like everyone else. And Jewish life wasn't going to happen unless I stepped in. There were so few of us. So literally, I made a difference on whether or not there'd be a minyan and whether or not we could have services. I made a difference on whether or not there would be Shabbat dinner because we had to cook our Shabbat dinner. There were so few Jews back then. There was no building. And we had a teacher Michael Paley, who helped us see how beautiful it was and how much fun it was and what the meaning was in what we were doing, why Shabbat was meaningful and why it made a difference.
So, Jevin, you get meaning, you get Jewish meaning, you get what being part of a real Jewish community can do. And at some point, as I understand it, you decide you want to become a rabbi. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, there's an important intermediate step. So I end up spending a lot of time with Arthur Hertzberg, who wrote the Zionist idea. And I go to Israel for the first real time. And I spent the summer at Hebrew University, and I became friends with the first truly religious young people I'd ever met before. And it was very exciting to see people connected and talking about and thinking about God. I had never discussed God with my family. I never heard God's name before, other than maybe, in the context of prayer. And these were people living and in relationship with God every single minute. I fell in love with that. That was so seductive, so exciting. So when I see that and I see how little knowledge I have, Hertzberg used to say to us in his classes, "You're far too intelligent to be so ignorant." If any of you have heard of Arthur Hertzberg, you know that's exactly the kind of thing he would say. And what he meant was none of us had been Jewishly educated. None of us spoke Hebrew. None of us had ever studied Tanakh or Talmud. And Hertzberg didn't teach that. He taught history and philosophy. So we came into conversations about Jewish history and Jewish philosophy without Hebrew and without Torah. And what he was really saying is he wished we had that. So I yearned for that, and I realized if I went to rabbinic school or if I made Aliyah, one or the other, I could get that. So I was really toying with both of those as possibilities.
So what happened when you tell your family of origin that you've described, Jewish without Judaism,
Right.
Go to Harvard, become a doctor, get rich. You tell them that you're thinking about becoming a rabbi. How did that land?
So I had three options. Option one was go to rabbinic school at JTS. I had the application. Option two was move to Israel and just see how it goes. And as you all know, by the way, back then it was not Startup Nation. It was socialist, backward, all that, and amazing, but it was that. The third option was go through corporate recruiting at an Ivy League school. By the way, I did not want to be a doctor, so I had already disappointed my family. So those were the three options in front of me, and I had done some work on each of the three of them. My mother and my father could not discuss the Jewish stuff with me. They just couldn't relate to it. I think I remember my mom saying, when I said, what do you think? What do you think? And she said something like, if that's what you want, as we all know how our mothers might say, which is a, I'm not approving. But I did. There was one person in my family who had some money. It was my father's father, who never graduated high school, but who had joined a family business and then taken it over and then made enough money to have some money.
What was his name?
That's his grandpa Manny. He's the one, by the way, who said no one in Israel really speaks Hebrew. He really said that multiple times to me. So I went to see Grandpa Manny because I thought if I get Grandpa Manny's blessing, he has enough money where he might be able to help me send my children to college someday if I don't make enough money. He might be able to help me get an apartment if I live in Israel or if I'm a rabbi. So I went with him, and I remember exactly where we were. I convinced him to go to the Statue of Liberty with me for the day because I thought it would be a nice day. And we're literally standing on that island where the Statue of Liberty is, and I said, Grandpa, I'm thinking, I'm thinking, and I wanted to discuss with you and get your thoughts. And he said, please sit down, and he berated me. He said, how dare you do something so beneath our family? Becoming a rabbi is the worst thing I could imagine for you. If you'd go down that path, don't ever expect a penny from me. That was Grandpa Manny. So he was the one who was truly outright negative. The others were very quiet and like my mother saying, if that's what you want. And by the way, there was a part of me, as there is still today, that was like them. I came from them. That's where I'm from. So there was a lot of struggle going on at that moment.
So what was the net effect of it all? After you got that reaction, what did you choose to do?
So I went to see Hertzberg because that's what I always did until he was no longer with us, and I still imagine the conversation with him when I have the tough decisions. Well, now when I have tough decisions, I imagine what Hertzberg would say, and then I go see Wes. Raise your hand if you've ever gone to see Wes, right? So Hertzberg said to me, do you mind if I quote him?
No, go
because there's a little bit of... he first of all said, distance yourself from your grandfather. And then he said, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go make some money and then go tell all these people to go fuck themselves. And then you can do what you really want to do. And if you know Hertzberg, you know that's exactly what he would say. And as usual, I listened to him.
Wow. So could you...
Do you mind that I cursed?
No, it's okay. It's okay.
It's not my words. It's his words. I actually don't curse.
So, Jevin,
It's what he said.
You don't become a rabbi right away. You go into business. And could you just share, just for framing, tell us a little bit about your business career.
So I did the thing you would do when you were an Ivy League grad at that time. I went into management consult. There were a few detours along the way, which I don't want to bore you with. But I went into management consulting. I went to Harvard Business School. I was a partner at McKinsey. I then did what smart people do and followed in the footsteps of Shira and went to Staples. And that's how I became in love with Wes and Shira and their whole family 22 years ago. And I was there 10 years. And then the founder of Staples recruited me to leave to go be the CEO of David's Tea, which I did for 2 years. So that was a 25-year business career.
Wow. And then after David's Tea, you went back to your rabbinical dreams.
Yeah. So one thing I did decide after the episode with my grandfather was to continue my personal Jewish journey. So I did end up getting very active in Jewish life as a lay leader. I also had a non-written prenuptial agreement with Janine, my wife, that our children would go to day school, so they would have the Jewish education neither of us ever had. And we agreed to have a kosher home and to celebrate Jewish holidays and to make Israel a big part of our lives. So we went as a family, 8, 9 times to Israel. And I ended up chairing the board of Dartmouth Hillel for 5 years. I chaired the board of Harvard for Hillel for 5 years. And there were numerous times when I considered jumping ship to the nonprofit sector, one of which was when I was offered the job to be CEO of Hillel International when I was 35 years old. And when I turned that down at the very last minute, they had asked me a question, what do you do for your Jewish learning? And I was very embarrassed by my answer. My answer was, well, what do you mean? I'm busy. I'm chairman of this and chairman of that, and I do this and that. And I really hated my answer. So I decided I was going to do something about it, and I went to Rabbi Perkins, who was my rabbi in Temple Aliyah. Hello, Howard, who's here from Temple Aliyah, and asked him if he could help me find a Hebrew teacher. So I found Harvey Shapiro, who a number of you might know, and Harvey agreed to be my Hebrew teacher. So we started with Ivrit Min HaChatchalah, Hebrew from the beginning. It's a course. And we met every week, first at Starbucks and then at Panera for 10 years.
At what time would you meet him?
It was around 6:30 in the morning on Fridays for 10 years. And the goal was learn enough Hebrew so that I could do the tikkun, the repair to Hertzberg's admonitions, that I would no longer be not so ignorant. And it was Hertzberg's, it was his challenge. And it was absolutely the best thing I've ever done, study Torah, other than family. And so I'll never forget, I was getting ready to leave David's Tea, and Harvey said to me, the most fun thing, the most amazing thing you do is study with me, you've said. Could you imagine what that would be like if you did that every day? And then right around the same time, I had remembered when Shira was the head of HR at Staples, she did something called the corporate athlete. And the premise is if you're healthy physically, spiritually, and mentally, that you'll be able to contribute more to your company. And one of the things they did is they asked us to do an exercise. What would you like to have on your tombstone? Have any of you ever done this? And it was in the context of having done a lot of thinking. So this was kind of the end point. What would you like to have on your tombstone? And I'll never forget where we were. We were on Martha's Vineyard. We were in this fancy hotel, and we were in their conference room. And I'm writing down what will go on my tombstone. Remember, I'm a senior executive at Staples. I want to be the CEO of there or somewhere else someday. And I write down on the piece of paper, made a difference for the Jewish people. And then I look down and I say, oh my God, I'm in the wrong place. And it was the combination of that Torah that I got, plus Hertzberg's words, and Harvey saying, you'd love this, where I really, in a real way, remembered my dream of becoming a rabbi.
And could you tell us just about, you were in rabbinical school at Hebrew College for how long?
5 years.
And could you say a word about that? What was it like that a dream deferred was not denied? It was realized a bit later.
It was a dream come true. I tell students, dreams do come true. I literally would wake up and say, is this real? I'm actually studying Torah for my full-time thing? I remember one of the semesters I was in Jerusalem, and I would walk from the German colony, Emek Raphaim, up to the conservative yeshiva where we were studying Talmud every day. And as the sun would rise, I'm looking at the walls of Jerusalem, and the tears would come down with joy. I couldn't believe it, that I was actually doing it. My students and my teachers would say, you are the most positive person ever. And I said, but this is my lifelong dream. So I started at the age of 47, rabbinic school.
Wow. And you do Hebrew College Rabbinical Program for 5 years.
5 years.
And then tell us, how do you end up at BU?
So in my 4th year at rabbinic school, you're supposed to do an internship, as I'm sure many of you know, and that's part of rabbinic school. And right around the time I'm trying to figure out my 4th year internship, I get a call from the head of Hillel International. Would I consider taking a leave of absence to go save BU Hillel because it's bankrupt and they can't find anyone? It's bankrupt and broken. And I said, well, I'm definitely not taking a leave of absence. I'm 51 years old or 50 years old. I waited long enough. But I learned in my business career you can do more than one thing at once. So I agreed to take as my internship, taking over BU Hillel as the executive director and trying to save it. So I ended up doing that way more than full-time while I was also doing rabbinic school full-time.
And so you've been at BU Hillel now for how long?
Almost 8 years.
Almost 8 years. So could you step back, Jevin, and paint a picture of BU Hillel. Paint a picture of the Jewish life at BU. Demographically, are there a few Jews, a lot of Jews? What kind of background do they come from? What are they looking for, et cetera?
So there's one thing in particular that's quite different about BU than, there's two things that are quite different, I think, about BU and Jewish life there than other places. One is there are more Jews at BU than any private university in the world. Private university in the world. If you include public universities, it's the top 7 or 8, including universities in Israel. So there are 4,000 Jewish undergraduate students. There's about 2,000 Jewish graduate students. So we have 6,000 Jews who every day are within a half a mile or so of each other. So it's very, very intensely Jewish. It's almost 25% Jewish. There's a whole history of why that is that I can tell you about another time. So that's one thing that's very, very, very different about BU. There's another thing I'd say half different about BU than everywhere else, was it's much politically less active than other places, especially given its size and inside the city. But the most important thing is there's lots and lots of Jews.
Can we just double click there for a second? Shira Talushkin has written in Tablet about shrinking Jewish percentages at Ivy Leagues. You know, at Penn used to be this percent Jewish, now it's much less. Harvard used to be this percent Jewish, now it's much less. Did that diminishment of the Jewish population not happen at BU? And if not, why not?
It didn't. And by the way, all of the numbers you hear about how many Jews there are at each college, they're self-reported by the Hillel director, because no one really knows. In a few cases, there are surveys done where students are asked to identify their religion. BU says it's illegal. I don't think it is, because there's many schools who ask it. So it's done, it's a guess. Harvard kept bringing their numbers down because they just knew there were fewer and fewer Jewish students at Harvard. When I chaired the board in 2000, around 2000, year 2000, we thought we were around 20% Jewish at Harvard. And now I think their guess is 8 or 9% Jewish. Dartmouth is 10. At BU, it's still over 20% Jewish. The biggest driver of this at the schools is not anti-Semitism, it's diversity. Because Jews are mostly white in America, and they mostly live in a handful of places. So as you want geographic diversity, and you're looking for race, up until this year you were allowed to do that, it was a big old negative. At BU, I believe what happened is as BU got more elite, more and more Jews applied to BU. So even though the geography was working against the Jews, more elite, more highly qualified Jews were applying. And when you add it all up, you get to roughly the same percentage.
Wow. So talk about, so that's a quantitative thing, lots of Jews, something like 20%. Talk about qualitative. What does that mean for day-to-day life of the Jewish community at BU? And also talk to us about what are your Jewish students at BU looking for?
Yeah. Okay, so this is the big thing, and this is not unique to BU. How many of you are over, do you mind if I ask if you're over 50? You can lie if you want, but I'm just roughly. Okay, so I'm 57. You're amazing for telling the truth. Way to go. Yeah, Yashar Koach. Okay, so for those of us who are over 50, most of us in this room have 2 Jewish parents. In fact, almost all of us, for the most part, have 2 Jewish parents. When I was a student at Christian Dartmouth, where there were no Orthodox Jews, over 90% of the Jews had 2 Jewish parents and did all those things I mentioned. More than half of the Jews did all those things I mentioned before: Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Seder, Hanukkah, Bar Mitzvah, and many of us had been to Israel. The single biggest thing in Jewish life on a college campus now, in my opinion, is not anti-Semitism. The single biggest thing is how different Jews are today and what's on their mind. Way more than half of the Jews on campus come from a home that has a Christian parent. Game changer, everybody. Mom or dad is Christian. I come from a Christian home. Many of these students celebrate Christmas. Way more of them celebrate Christmas than Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur. By the way, they would say Christmas is not religious, as of course, right? But so the typical Jewish student who comes to see me, the Hillel rabbi, has a mom or dad not Jewish, celebrates Christmas, has not been bar bat mitzvahed, does not belong to a synagogue. We all know that less than 10%, I think it's 7 or 8% of Jews under the age of 20 come from families that are members of the conservative movement, belong to conservative synagogues. Almost none of the students I meet come from conservative synagogues. They've not been to Israel. They've not been bar bat mitzvah. They don't celebrate Rosh Hashanah. They might have been to a Seder. They might light Hanukkah candles. By the way, we have so many Jews. We have plenty of Jews who do all those things, but most don't. That is a earthquake change in the American Jewish community.
So why would a student that you've described come to see you, the Hillel rabbi? What are they looking for? Why would they even walk in the door?
So this is why there's hope. The vast majority of these students are proud of their Jewish identity. They're proud. They have good feelings about being Jewish. And while they haven't done those things, almost all of them have done one or two of those things. And in America, up until recently, it was actually considered desirable to be Jewish, as we know from the White Houses that each have Jewish children or grandchildren in them. Being Jewish was, in many circles, a positive. It still is, in many circles, a positive. There's pride, there's connection, there's curiosity, and so those are lots of positives. By the way, almost all of them positive on Israel until October 7th, and even still, the vast majority are positive. And then there's one other reason why they come to Hillel. They're lonely. And I got this word from Wes. The number one opportunity with Jewish students is they have a positive view of their Jewish identity. By the way, the majority of them would say they're Jewish culturally, not religiously. The demographers would say Jews of no religion, which is the largest and fastest growing group of Jews in America. That's them. But there's lots of positives in that. And then the negative in their life is they're lonely, they want friends. The biggest problem in American Jewish life, again, a lot of things have changed and we're going to figure them out after October 7th. But the biggest problem outside of that is loneliness. They want friends, they want belonging. And at least at BU, the Hillel that we've created since it was broken and we rebirthed it, is targeting that one thing. How do we help people see that the antidote to their loneliness is Judaism and the Jewish people? And they know that when they come, they will be welcomed for who they are. And in fact, our slogan that we came up with as part of our turnaround was, come as you are, make it your own. Come as you are, make it your own. There's one sticker on the door of BU Hillel. Actually, now there's 3. There are 2 very large Israeli flags, and there is 1 little gay pride sticker. And by the way, the Israel thing, we are on the far Zionist side of the Hillel spectrum, incidentally. Not every Hillel right now feels comfortable putting up Israeli flags. We certainly do.
So, Jevin, before we get to October 7th and how the world just got so much more complicated, I want to just step back. So you've got these students, numerous students, 6,000 students, 25%, something like that. They come from a different kind of demography than people over 50. Many of them have non-Jewish parents. They grow up in a home that has Christian motifs and traditions and Christmas, etc., and Jewish. They're Jewish culturally, not necessarily religiously. And they come to BU Hillel, and they're looking for connection, looking to Jewish community as the antidote to loneliness. Before October 7th,
Yeah.
Can you give us an example of a program or of a thing you did that really worked?
Yeah, so by the way, we reach 3,000 of our 4,000 undergrads every year at least once, and we reach about 800 of them frequently. So 800 of them are regulars. Harvard has fewer than 800 Jews. We have that many that come all the time. It looks different than when we were around, or different than 30 years ago at BU. At BU 30 years ago, the Hillel was about Shabbat dinner and holidays and Shabbat services, and the building was full for those. The building's not actually full for those. We have way more attendance at Hillel things now than then, and we have way fewer attending those things than then. The two biggest things that we do that reach students, number one is our Jewish learning program. So we have 130 to 140 students who learn with us on a weekly basis, 6 to 7 Jewish learning classes, all of which have traditional texts in conversation with something contemporary. Contemporary texts, contemporary motifs, songs, videos, etc. And the students absolutely love this, and we have the largest Jewish learning program, or one of the largest anywhere.
Give an example of that kind of cool class.
Well, so the most popular class is called Sex, Love, and Romance. The second most popular class is Badass Jewish Women from the Bible. The third most popular class is The World of Wine and the Importance of Wine in Judaism, which includes wine tasting for 21 and up. But we have 39 different courses we've created in the last 8 years. And it's a long story. The national movement helps oversee this. We're one of the few places that's allowed to develop our own curriculum, so we're constantly developing curriculum. We have one on pluralism. We have one that I created on how do Jews live in a Christian world. That was a fascinating class. So it's an endless, so that's one big one, the Jewish learning. The other is what we call the BLT, the Boston University Leadership Team, pun intended. This is our leadership platform. So we have 190 students who are basically leaders in our Hillel, who lead anything they want that will bring them joy. We will help support them with staffing and money, and we will help them infuse it with Jewish content on any topic they want. So it can be things very Jewish, like Challah for Hunger. It could be a fun run. It could be volunteering in an old age home. It could be the arts, you name it. We also have about 10 different cohorts of interns, interns and workers for Hillel, and they're all in these cohorts, as are the Jewish Learning Fellowship, because the number one problem is they're lonely. So we solve their loneliness by putting them into a cohort with a Jewish educator, and then they're no longer lonely. They find themselves there.
So that's the world that you and your colleagues helped create before October 7th. How did all of that you just described get changed by October 7th and the 6 months plus of war since then?
So there were people ringing the anti-Semitism bell before October 7th. And we would have said more than a year before October 7th, anti-Semitism, people who are talking about anti-Semitism are overreacting. There's very little at BU. And there was very little overt anti-Semitism at BU. Around a year before October 7th, we started noticing changes in America, though, and we actually started doing some education and training with some support from CJP on anti-Semitism. But everything changed on October 7th. It was a sea change. There were, as we were saying to everyone at that moment, there were two complete shocks to the system. One was that Israel couldn't defend itself. That was a complete shock to the system. And the other was that in a place of higher learning, particularly in the city of Boston, that there could be so much hate towards Jews. And it went from very minimal examples of anti-Semitism, you had to really look for it, to everyday life was filled with Jew hating, disguised as Israel hating. Did you all know about the report cards that just came out on Friday? I think it was Friday, Thursday or Friday. The ADL rated, I think it was 100 schools or so, 15 of which got Fs, 2 of which got As, BU got a C. I think it was an accurate rating. And one of the things that was just so surprising was not only how many Jew haters there were, but how few friends we have. After October 7th, October 8th or 9th, I received one official phone call, like one phone call from someone at BU who said, I am calling from organization A to show my allegiance with you as the leader of BU Hillel, as the leader of our Jewish community at BU. I received one phone call of that kind, and it was from the chief of police. And we have superb relationships at BU, by the way. This is not, there's certain campuses where there's a lot of tension between the Hillel and the administration. Our relationships were and still are great on a personal basis. We have friends at the president's office, the provost office. The provost of BU, by the way, at the moment is a member of Temple Emmanuel. We have great relationships, and no one called. And there were certain groups that showed themselves as Jew-hating and actually celebrated the massacre. And we ended up with this paralysis where the university was very, very good and quick at asserting that they would protect us physically and putting the police cars in front and tearing down posters when they were illegally in places very quickly. They were very, very good at that, and we've had a lot of problems, a lot of challenges with everything other than that.
Jevin, were you surprised by the reaction you just described? Were you surprised by what was said or not said, the gestures that were made or not made on October 7th, October 8th, October 9th? Did that surprise you?
Oh, yeah. I mean, my whole understanding as an American changed. I never thought we'd live to see this. It's just, I also never thought that we'd live to see an Israel that couldn't defend itself. My whole sense of self changed, and I know I'm not alone. Many of you in this room that was true for, and certainly many, our most active students are Israeli students. Being embarrassed to show your identity because you're afraid that you're going to physically get hurt. The students who've said they can't wear their Jewish stars, they took off their kippah. At BU, and BU is not a bastion of anti-Semitism historically. So it was, I never imagined my rabbinate would be fighting Jew hate. I thought my rabbinate was going to be about lonely students and bringing them to Torah. It still is, by the way, and I'm not going to let that stop. But I never thought I'd also have to become an expert and teacher about Jew hate. And one of the things we've done is we immediately, because this whole Jewish learning thing is so core to what we do, we immediately adopted our anti-Semitism curriculum, and we launched a course for deans of the college. And we had about 20 some odd deans and department heads of the university take this class with me and do the learning. And they're very, very interested in learning what is the difference between legitimate criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism. And that's what we're trying to help them with.
And Jevin, could you just tell the story? You once shared this story, just truth in advertising. When you told me this story one Shabbos after services, I just got so pissed off. I just got so pissed off. And it filled me with hatred and rage. And I'm wondering if you'll share the story of your reaching out to the DEI office, or in Arthur Hertzberg's spirit, the fucking DEI office.
I'm going to do a detour, because I'm allowed to. I have the mic. Dara Horn spoke at BU Hillel 2 weeks ago. We have David Wolpe coming this week. By the way, you can come if you want to. She was incredible. And someone asked her the question, should we just get rid of DEI? What do you think? And she said, look, I know Barry Weiss has said get rid of it. Here's the issue. It is impossible to get rid of DEI, so we should just focus on what we can do versus what's possible or impossible. And she said, you know why it's impossible to get rid of DEI? She was talking about Harvard. She said, because when we were on this committee that I was on for fighting anti-Semitism for the university, we actually got the numbers on how many people work in DEI at Harvard, and there are 800. And she said it's impossible to imagine firing 800 or reassigning 800 people. It's just not going to happen. So BU has DEI people at the president's office, at the provost's office, and then in every one of its 19 colleges. I don't even know how many there are. I had met the one who was in the president's office, which I figured that's the most senior one. And I remember meeting with her 1 or 2 weeks before October 7th, and I had this whole agenda, and I said to her, I would love for the Jews to be allies of you in your work. Please tell me how we can be your allies. And I'd also love to see if you could support us by including Jews in your work. And I assumed we'd have like a business meeting. Like she would tell me, well, here are the bullet points of how you can get involved, and here are the bullet points of how we can help you. And she said to me, isn't the world terrible and filled with hate? And I said, yes, the world is filled with hate, and that's why we should help you, and you should include the Jews. And I said, so how can we help you? Well, the world is filled with hate. And I couldn't get anything specific beyond that, other than the world is filled with hate, and I couldn't get any recognition there were problems with the Jews. Okay, then October 7th comes. I had just met with her in my office. I served her tea. Silence, not a response from her, along with everyone else. So I reached out to her and asked her to join this learning circle with the deans and the department heads on anti-Semitism, because it was obvious to me she didn't know anything about Jews. And no response. And then I wrote again, I didn't hear a response from you, and I'm really interested in you joining us. And I got back an email. I have this in writing. The email was, I am so sorry that I cannot join you for your anti-Semitism training because I am too busy with my responsibilities for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So there is, they cannot, so there's one DEI person at the whole university who has reached out to me. One at the whole university for help, for training, et cetera. She's at the School of Public Health. She's very, very nice. They are so not capable of seeing Jews as needing help.
So can you just step back for that, not to get hijacked on this issue, but how could it be that somebody who's committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion and lives to see October 7th is too busy for the Jews?
Right.
How do you explain that? What is that?
Okay, so there's two different
That's DEI, by the way.
Right. There's two different explanations I can share that are very related, but they're slightly different language. So one is that there is a worldview that has taken over the university. By the way, I view myself as liberal, okay? So that's like headline. There is a worldview that has taken over the university where justice is more important than truth, and where the number one problem is rising up certain types of people, and then this is the key, and then holding accountable other types of people. And a lot of that thinking came from the anti-racism work that's been done. And the anti-racism work says that there are only two types of people, oppressed and oppressors. If you're not oppressed, then you're not only unjustly benefiting, but you are the problem. So under that language, by the way, and that's a world that sees everyone as binary in terms of race. You're either black or you're not. And Jews are absolutely benefiting in the ways in which they are seeing the world. Jews disproportionately benefit. We have higher income. We're more likely to get into college, more likely to be in the boardroom, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So therefore, the observation that we're benefiting is that we're not only unjustly benefiting, but we are part of the problem. By the way, it's not just Jews that are part of the problem, but from that view, the Jews are the uber example. We are the uber example of oppressors because we're unjustly benefiting. So that's one. So if you're the DEI person whose mission is to help people who are being oppressed, there's just no way you can imagine yourself helping Jews, because Jews are the oppressors. The other thing that Dara Horn shared with us, she said DEI is based on one aspect of prejudice. It's based on the aspect of prejudice that is people who've been lower on the rung socially and trying to lift them up. And Jews do not have that problem. Jews have a different problem. Our problem is conspiracy. So the problem with Jews is that we're viewed as part of a conspiracy to take power away from people who have power, or to take identity away from people with identity. DEI is not set up to handle conspiracy theories. DEI is set up to handle social injustice.
So, Jevin, let me just step back with you now. We're now 6 months and a few weeks, 6 months and I guess 1 week, 6 months and 1 week from October 7th. And you had talked pre-October 7th about your agenda of being with the Jews whom you've described, who are culturally Jewish, not necessarily religiously Jewish, and helping them find community and connection and friendship, antidote to loneliness. Then you talked about the cataclysmic change brought about by October 7th, what it revealed about our world that was shocking, etc. 6 months and 1 week later, if you were to do a USA Today pie chart, what percentage of your heart, time, and energy is devoted to combating Jew hatred? And what percent, in other words, what percentage of your time do you have your defense on the field? What percentage of your time do you have your offense on the field, where you're trying to help Jewish undergrads find meaning and connection?
I think and it's funny, Barry Schrage called me, I don't know, a month or two ago from Ben Gurion Airport. Jevin, I have to speak to you right now. He's literally, it's like, I don't know, midnight there. And his big message to me was, I want to make sure you're focused on taking care of the Jewish students, not just fighting the anti-Semites. Remembering that. That is clearly our number one. It's my number one, and it's even more the Hillel's number one, because I'm, myself and Ethan, our executive director who works with me, we're the ones doing most of the anti-Semitism work. We've got to keep our game. Our game is connecting Jewish students to meaningful, joyous Jewish lives. We lose if we stop doing that. So we must stay connected to that, and we also have to fight the anti-Semites. We have to do both of them. The first one is the most important. We're not the ADL, we're Hillel. I wasn't trained in fighting anti-Semitism. I am trained in Torah. But there's no one else on campus standing up for our Jewish students with the Jew hate, so we have to do that also. And just like I was able to be a Hillel director and a rabbinic school, we can be a Hillel that's there for our Jewish students with Jewish meaning and purpose, and that's there to defend and protect our Jewish students. By the way, since October 7th, we've had more people hang out in the building than ever before. We've also had a decrease in numbers of non-Jews coming to some of our very light touch events, our free food events, et cetera. We still get plenty, but it's definitely decreased. This year, we're on track to have more attendance at things BU Hillel than ever before, about 34,000 times.
Wow. Jevin, could you step back and share how you think October 7th and the 6 months and 1 week of war since October 7th have changed your students' feelings, one, about being Jewish, and two, about Israel?
So I think there's three segments. One segment is the really committed and engaged and involved students when it comes to Israel. The second segment is a segment of Jews who are really torn about Israel and who are right now holding Israel accountable, and some of whom even are saying and acting in anti-Semitic ways. So we've got the fighters, and we have a real problem segment. And then there's the middle, which actually doesn't think about it very much. I think each campus has different percentages in each street, and it changes over time. My perception of our campus, from what I can tell, is the segment of, call it anti-Semitic Jews or anti-Israel Jews, is very small at BU. It's bigger in many other places. For a lot of my colleagues, they are feeling great tension about losing those Jewish students forever. Great tension and great concern and great fear. So a lot of them would not speak about Israel the way we do. We make no apologies for Israel. We are not critical of Israel right now in any way publicly. We say we stand with Israel. We are Zionist. If you are a non-Zionist, you are welcome in our building, you're welcome in our learning, but we're not going to bring your non-Zionist activities and learning into our Hillel. We recently had a student, we have very few people like this. He happens to be very active, he co-leads our conservative minyan, and he offered to donate his book collection to us when he graduates because we don't have enough anti-Zionist books in the Hillel. Now, thank goodness we haven't accepted book donations in 8 years, so we can just say, honestly, we're not accepting your donation because we don't accept any donations of books at this time. So there are people like him everywhere, and there is a much higher percentage of people like him at other schools than there are at BU. The vast majority of BU students are in that middle. And by the way, that first group was larger and is shrinking. Students are back to worrying about their jobs and their courses and their internships and all of that. And that first group, which is still there and still fighting, and they're amazing, of real Zionists and people for whom this is a big deal. But we have to recognize that these segments all exist. For some people, and there could be some of you in this room, you might have children or grandchildren, who view Israel as an unethical country that shouldn't, some of whom will say Israel does not have a right to exist. That is an anti-Semitic view, but there are Jews who believe that. There are Jews who are active in Students for Justice in Palestine. However, we have to remember, in any population, there's always going to be a segment that is an outlier. That's true in anything. So we should not think that's what the American Jewish youth are. The vast majority of American Jewish youth support Israel and are proud of their Jewish heritage.
So, Jevin, I want to just gently push back.
Please.
My sense is that the ravages of 6 months and a week of war, who knows what the number is, but something like 30,000 dead, including surely many who were innocent civilians caught in the crosshair. Famine, I mean, the world saw the picture of the 10-year-old Palestinian boy who died of famine, and you could see the bones of his skeleton because he hadn't had food to eat. And then the bombing of the food workers. Reasonable Jewish undergrads could say, this isn't my Israel. Like, where's the strategy? Where's the vision? How does this solve anything? This is just going to create a whole new generation of Israel haters. There's no strategy. This is Bibi trying to stay out of prison, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's broadly felt by college kids and others in the Jewish community. How do you handle that critique? What do you say to students who feel that?
We have very few students who are saying that at BU.
Really?
And that's different than other schools.
How do you explain that?
I think
that critique is not without basis.
Yeah. By the way, we have some staff members, we have some donors who are saying those things. Saying those things are not anti-Semitic. In fact, 70% of Israelis are saying those things. So when I said up front, there were two things that were different about BU. One was we have so many Jews, and the other is that we're not very politically engaged. So this is that we're not very politically engaged.
So let me just shift and ask you for some practical advice.
Yeah.
Most of us will be at a Seder, hosting a Seder, guest at a Seder, a week from tomorrow night. And what do you do around the Seder table when our college-age kids say that? They say, I'm embarrassed by Israel. The famine, I didn't sign up for famine. I didn't sign up for 30,000 dead. I didn't sign up for zero strategy. I don't see how this advances our Jewish homeland's strategic goals. I don't see how this makes any kind of long-term peace any more likely or any long-term security any more likely. If anything, it's going to radicalize the next generation. What do you do around the Seder table when you hear that?
Okay, so first of all, I think it's important to be able to listen to what's actually not only what's being said, but what's not being said. If the problem is Israel's existence, it's different than if the problem is Israel's current behavior in Gaza. And I think being able to try and tease that out. One of the things we learn as educators is it's not our job to say things, it's our job to ask questions. And certainly that's the theme of the Seder. Do not expect you to change someone's mind If they're younger than you, they're older than you, the same age of you at one Seder. So if you want to engage in a conversation that someone might actually view as meaningful to them, ask them questions. Help them be able to see what actually is the nature of their comment. So when people say to me they're upset with, they hate Israel, I say, thank you for sharing that. Which Israel are you upset with? You upset with the state, the country, the land, or the people? And then I ask them, and if you're upset with that Israel, are you upset with that equivalent America? And just those two questions often make light bulbs go off in students. So I'm guessing some of the people who might get you going, who would ask these questions, do not have a problem with 1948 Israel, have a problem with 1967 or post-Israel. God bless them. That's great that they're showing their passion. We want, as we've heard from Elie Wiesel, the biggest problem is indifference. Okay, so then what do we do with the problem being 1948 Israel? What do we do with people at our table saying, I don't think Israel should exist. Its underlying idea is immoral. So I would take two approaches. One is the historical one, and the other is into the Haggadah itself. The historical one would just be to ask the student the question, do you have a problem with other peoples having their home? Because if you're just picking on the Jews and no one else, what does that say about your critique of Israel? Just ask the question. Israel's existence under that line of questioning is human rights. It's not Jewish rights. All people are entitled to a land of their own. Why not the Jews too? If that's what they're seeing, at least helping them see it that way will hopefully get through to them at some point. So that's one approach. The other one is use the rhetoric of the Seder itself. Passover is not referred to as a happy holiday. And the rabbis ask, why is that? Why is it not a happy holiday? It's our national liberation holiday. There's a lot of good things that happen to us in this particular story. Why on this holiday do we diminish the wine in our cups? To remember the negative things that happen to our enemies. Why on this holiday do we actually call on God to pour out God's wrath on our enemies who rise to destroy us in every generation? Which, by the way, how can we not feel that for real this year? How can we not feel that for real and want to say those words? I know I do. And then why is it we do not recite a full Hallel on every single day of Passover as we do on every single day of Sukkot and Hanukkah? It's because the holiday is not filled only with joy, this national liberation holiday. And while I don't think what I just said has the answer, asking us to consider what that means as we're in conversation with our young people, let's raise that question to them. What do we do with that thought? As in every generation they rise to destroy us, and as at this moment we still think of our enemies even when they're the worst of the worst, and we remember that we now have freedom to go do something with.
Wow, so what I hear you saying, Jevin, very wisely is respond to their voices more with questions and with answers, and elicit more of their voices and listen more carefully to their voices. Nobody convinces anybody of anything, but if the goal can be not convincing but listening, then that kind of decent conversation is a good thing. Jevin, I want to thank you for super thoughtful responses. I want to invite folks, let's take like 3 questions or so. If anybody has any questions for Jevin Eagle. Ed Altshuler, my neighbor on Montrose Street.
Thank you very much. I think one of my biggest disappointments is the media. Hamas is a terrorist organization. The media treats them like they're freedom fighters. You look at the media, they talk about all the terrible things that are going on in Gaza. Not a word that the problem is Hamas. Hamas is going to lose this war. And the sooner they're neutralized, the fewer people will suffer. So I think Israel has 3 goals. Number 1, they have to get the hostages back. Number 2, they have to neutralize Hamas. And number 3, they have to make sure that October 7th never happens again.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you so much. So thank you. I want to just invite people to ask a short question. I mean, I agree with everything you said, but right now we're in the market for 3 short questions. If you have a short question, Svi, I'll call on you. Short question.
What activity you do to the other 80% of non-Jew at the campus to educate them?
What do we do for the non-Jews?
Yeah. What kind of activity educate them?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and we actually have this whole initiative aimed at non-Jews now, which includes education and engagement. So the key to our model is getting people in cohorts talking and having one-on-one conversations. So we now, every semester, are offering classes on anti-Semitism for non-Jews. We're actually taking non-Jews to Israel, God willing, in a few weeks. I don't know what's going to happen now. Non-Jewish student leaders who are identified as non-Jewish student leaders. And then we have a cadre of Fighting Hate fellows that go out and are supposed to have one-on-one conversations with non-Jews, and they get trained by us and by resetting the table, which I think has been here before, to help. By the way, we're not winning that battle, but we're certainly in there. We're certainly fighting that.
Jevin, thank you. Marty, short question.
Would you mind repeating the questions you talked about when somebody says what type of Israel you were referring to? I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
One of my favorite things of all time, and I give credit to my teacher, Harvey Shapiro. There are 4 Israels. Am Yisrael, the people Israel, Medinat Yisrael, the state of Israel, Memshalat Israel, the government of Israel, and Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. And if you also say there's those equivalent still 4s in America, ask them which Israel, and ask them, are they uniquely finding that problem with just Israel? Or are they also having a problem elsewhere with it? Because if their problem is with the Israeli government, just like they would have a problem with the American government, they're not Jew haters. If their problem is with the state of Israel existing, then they are, that's one of the definitions of anti-Semitism, that Jews alone are not entitled to our own state.
Danny, short question. Let me give you a microphone, even though you don't need it.
Yeah. So what's your secret sauce? I come from the Harvard world. I don't live in Harvard, but I see it, and it's they got an F.
Correct.
I went to BU. What's your secret sauce? How are you able to do that? And how can we transmit that to the rest of the Jewish world, youth world?
So I think there's three things. It's not just one. One is Harvard has a much more politically active student body than we do. So if we deployed our model at Harvard, it would not work as well at Harvard as it's working at BU. So let me just say that. And it might not work, quote, enough at all. The second thing is they've got to be building relationships and take the long game. If you start fighting hate at this moment, then you're in trouble. And the third thing is the Hillel should not be publishing statements and organizing physical rallies. That actually incites the other side. As I say to people, the goal here is not to fight and lose. The goal here is to fight and win. So we have to pick our battles and know exactly which battles to pick. It turned out that the new director of Hillel was an undergrad when I was the board chair 20-some odd years ago. So I've been in touch with Jason, and I'm hoping I can, to the extent I can help him. It's a very, very, very hard job right now. Very hard job.
Oy.
Oy is right.
All right. Steve Bookbinder, you get the last question, a short question from Steve Bookbinder.
Thank you very much for your presentation. You talked about the line between legitimate criticism of Israel and Jew hatred.
Yes.
Can you elaborate, and you've given examples of that, about Israel's right to exist. Can you elaborate on that line? Is that line pretty clear, or is that line hazy in many
Okay.
cases?
I believe it's clear, but the vast majority of people in power at BU and at schools like Harvard don't. So if you go to the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, you'll see in there it's primarily, just Google IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. It's in the detailed examples that they have. So saying that Jews and Jews alone are not entitled to our own land, our own state, that is anti-Semitism. Picking on and singling out Jews for behavior for standards that you only hold the Jewish state to and no other state to, that's anti-Semitism. Stereotyping is anti-Semitism. Accusing Jews of dual loyalty and no one else, that's anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, the people in power on college campuses do not agree with me. They believe that you can single out the Jews for having their own state and not view that as anti-Semitism. And they believe each of those other things can't be. So that's our biggest challenge now, is getting them to see that that's anti-Semitism. And for some reason, and it's the DNA that Western civilization has programmed into us, when it comes to the Jews, we have a different standard than when it comes to everyone else. I want to leave folks, though, on a positive note. Can I?
Yes, you can, but let me, can I tee you up on that?
Of course.
You are looking at many parents and grandparents who hopefully will be seeing their children and grandchildren for the Passover Seders. With what would you bless parents and grandparents so that they can inspire our children and grandchildren with a love of all the Israels you mentioned?
Okay, I'm gonna answer that by first reading you something that I received a few years ago from one of my favorite students. His name is Reed Romenko, and he has one Jewish parent, one non-Jewish parent, but he was brought up in a primarily Christian household, and then showed up at BU and was curious about his Jewish heritage. In class some Thursday ago, we talked about Rabbi Akiva and his whole idea of water slowly but surely eroding stone. I wasn't brought up in a household that practiced Judaism, as I mentioned. That said, I'm immensely interested in learning more about Judaism. Who knows, maybe someday in the future I'll be bar mitzvahed. Considering you're in rabbinic school and an integral part of BU Hillel, I imagine you would know of some resources that might help me with that. However, I do have a bit of a problem. Part of my scholarship and career requires me to do a lot of stuff outside of academics. If I were to study Torah, it would be a slow process. But much like you learned Hebrew over the course of a decade, if I remember right, I think I can learn to engage in Torah over a long stretch of time, a la Rabbi Akiva. I was just wondering if you had any resources or anything you could direct me to get started. Reed now works for the Federal Reserve Bank in St. Louis and says the Shema every day. That's what we're here for, everybody. We're here to tell our children that we love them and maybe tell this story to them. And we use this for a lot of our learning classes. Imagine you go into the most beautiful library you've ever seen. It's gorgeous. It smells beautiful. There's all these gorgeous bound books, and the fire's blazing, and it's incredible. And you walk in, and you start looking at the spines of the books, and you notice names of people who are familiar to you. It's parents and grandparents and cousins and great-grandparents, and it's the names that you've heard around the table. And all of a sudden, you see a book with no name on the spine. And you go up to that book, and as you look at that book and that blank spine, you realize, this book is for me. You need to help your students see your love of that library that you're already in, and you need to help empower them to make that book their own, not your book, their book, in this beautiful library of our people. That's my blessing for you, is that you feel the wisdom and the compassion to share that message with your children and your grandchildren. May you be blessed and have a meaningful Passover.
Jevin, thank you so much. Jevin, I just want to say, wow, you crushed it. You know, thank you. This was a tough slot before the weekend. Talk about campus anti-Semitism, hard to do that and leave people uplifted. then you add in for no extra charge, this conversation takes place after this horrific, surreal nightmare of last night with the situation still unresolved. You don't even know if your 2 busloads of folks, Jewish and non-Jewish, are going to be going to Israel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's the context for this conversation. And you managed to be honest, emotional, vulnerable, and helpful, and practical. And that is uplift that we all needed now. So Jevin, thank you so much. Brotherhood, thank you so much. And thank you all for coming this morning. Chag Kasher v'Sameach.